Today on Eigen Designs, I'm going to be experimenting with a couple of shaping discs that I bought from a company called Kutzall. In today's video, I'll be using those to create some interesting lines on an entryway table and help break up some of the standard rectangular shapes that I'm more accustomed to working with. I'll also be using some walnut dowels and some biscuit joinery to help fabricate the base and putting a nice 1/8" round over just to make it look a little bit more finished. I was really happy with how the final product turned out, so if you want to see how I built this particular entryway table, stick around and you'll find out. I began this project by fabricating the tabletop for this particular entryway table. I had a really nice piece of walnut that was about 15 inches wide and 8 feet long, but I didn't need the entryway table to be quite that long, so I went ahead and made a mark at 6.5 feet, and then I came back through with a straight edge and a circular saw and cut off the excess piece. Because the slab is 2 inches thick, I decided to make 2 passes with my circular saw just to make sure that there's a nice straight clean cut on the end. With the slab cut to length, I went over to my joiner to put a nice clean edge on it, and I gotta say it was really awkward running this very tall slab up against the shorter fence of my jointer. Probably not the ideal use for something like this. I know that there's jigs out there that you can make that can create a fresh edge using a joiner sled for your table saw. That's probably what I should use, but I did end up getting it done, just wasn't the ideal choice. But once I did have that straight edge, I was able to reference it against my table saw fence and rip the slab to an exact 15-inch width, which is what I was going to be using for the final dimension of the table. I then used some 80 grit sandpaper to remove some of the marks left behind by the planer, as well as the saw blade marks on the side of the slab from when we made the cross cut and the long rip to get it to 15 inches. Now, before I take the cutting discs to the wood, I'm trying to lay out a pattern of how I want the final end table to look. And I want it to be symmetrical on both sides, so I take a few measurements. And what I'm trying to do is to replicate the amount of wood that I'm cutting off from both sides to make sure that it's an even amount of wood taken off from both the left side of the table and the right side of the table. I didn't have an exact science whenever I went after this, so you see me here just using the edge of the level just to get a reference point for how much material I was going to be moving. I also used a couple of reference points to draw some diagonal lines to get a gradient of how the thickness of the table was going to transition from full thickness to the thinner edge on the side. Certainly not a lot of science applied here, but there was consistency from what I did to the right side as well as the left side. And I used these marks in the next step to help guide how much material I was moving as I was using the cutting discs. The cutting discs that I'll be using today are designed to be used with an angle grinder because they're intended to be used at very high RPM. There is an original shaping disc as well as an extreme, which is meant for significant removal. The extreme is the disc that you see here in blue, and you can see that it's got a little bit of a round shape on the edges and little tiny metal spikes. The original version is very similar design, but they're a little bit more, each of those little spikes are a little bit subdued. Whenever you see me cutting here, this is the first time that I'd actually used the tool, and I was pleasantly surprised by how easy it is to use. Given how much wood I was removing and just the nature of the tool, I expected there to be a lot of chatter and a lot of the disc kind of skipping off the surface of the wood that you were trying to cut. That was not the case, and that was not my experience whatsoever. It removed the wood in a very gentle way, and it is an aggressive tool, and if you try to turn it on its side, it will gouge the wood very quickly. So I found that using it kind of on a flat surface, using the broad side of the tool made for the best look so that you didn't have gouges in the wood. And I was able to remove quite a bit of wood in a short period of time. So once that was done, I came back with some 80 grit sandpaper. And you do have to do quite a bit of sanding to get those gouge marks out, because just the nature of the cutting creates a lot of fine grooves in the wood that you do have to sand out. But once that was done, this whole process probably took 30 minutes, maybe 45 minutes, and created a really unique shape. It's very common when working with walnut to have to do some epoxy corrections to the wood. I found that it's better whenever you have small, shallow knots like this to actually remove a little bit more wood so that you can get good epoxy coverage in that hole. And for these larger knots that you see here, try to remove as much of the soft wood as you can so that you've got really good epoxy adhesion to the hard wood that's around the knot. Once you've removed as much of the soft wood that's going to come out, you can then tape the knot and begin to pour the epoxy. A tip that I would recommend is to actually tape up the side that you want to look good and not do the bottom side, because by taping the top side, whenever the epoxy is poured, you create a flat surface against the tape, and air bubbles actually move away from the surface that you're trying to make look good, so you don't have any imperfections in the surface. The epoxy that I'll be using today is a 2-part epoxy resin mixed in a 1-to-1 ratio. This particular brand I found off of Amazon, and I've continued to use it because it gives good results. There's a couple of different ways to color epoxy. You can actually use some flakes, some powder, or you can use some liquid dye. In this particular case, I'm using some liquid dye, and I'm coloring it black just to ensure that you can't see through the epoxy and to give the wood a little bit more of a darker feel. Now, you can't really see it from the camera angle, but there is a pretty significant slope from all that wood that we removed from using the cutting discs. So I'm putting a barrier of silicone around the area that I'll be pouring the epoxy, just so that any extra doesn't end up flowing over the edge of the table. When I pour the epoxy, I try to start out at one side of the hole, particularly if it's a large continuous hole that goes all the way through the wood. That way you leave an avenue for air to escape. So as that epoxy is falling down and displacing the air that's in that cavity, the air itself actually still has a path back to the surface. If you cover the entire surface with epoxy all in one go, you can sometimes get rather large air pockets that get trapped, and you may or may not see it in your final product, but it's just better to let that air have a way of getting out. And no matter what you do, you're still going to have air bubbles in your epoxy, and you see them bubbling up right here. So taking a lighter or a blowtorch of some kind can help remove some of those surface bubbles, but I'd recommend keeping an eye on the epoxy over the first couple of hours as it's beginning to cure, beginning to set, making sure that you remove as many of the bubbles as you can, and more importantly, adding more epoxy if it's needed. Once the epoxy has had enough time to cure, you can come back with some medium grit sandpaper, 120, 150, and start to remove it. This particular epoxy that I'm using takes a full 48 hours to cure, so I recommend that you at least give it the minimum recommended time. Otherwise, if you try to sand epoxy before it's fully cured, you can end up getting into kind of a gummy substance that's not quite hard enough to sand, and it really ruins the look of the epoxy. So make sure you give it enough time and don't rush that part of the process. The design of the base is pretty simple, and it calls for a number of 4-inch wide walnut planks cut at various lengths. So I first start off by going to the miter saw and cutting everything to length, and then heading back over to my joiner to begin the milling process. So anytime I'm milling something, I always start off by jointing the face grain first. Once I've got a really nice flat surface on a plank, I will then use that and reference it against the fence of the jointer and get a nice straight edge on the edge grain of that particular board. Something I'll do is actually make some light pencil marks over the sides that are not yet surfaced, So you can see here some of the scribble marks, and that helps me remember what sides still need to be run through the planer. But before doing that, I rip all the boards to exactly 4 inches by referencing that straight edge that we just created with the jointer and using that up against the fence. I wanted to leave each of the boards as thick as possible, so every time I made an adjustment to the planer, I ran all the boards through, and I continued the process until all the pencil marks on the boards were all gone. And by running each one through the planer every time I made an adjustment, you can be assured that everything is going to be the same thickness. So that's how I created all the boards that were going to be used for the base assembly. Once that was done, I did a dry fit for each one of the legs to make sure that all the pieces would fit together. Then I came back through and made some pencil marks to identify where the biscuit joiner would need to make the cut into each one of the legs. I've actually been eyeing off Festool's domino cutter for quite a while, and they're just so darn expensive I haven't gotten the courage to actually buy one yet. So I'm using this biscuit joiner in lieu of something more like a domino joiner, but maybe one day I can add that tool to the arsenal of Icon design tools. But for now, we're going to have to go with the lower cost option of biscuits and walnut dowels. Once all the biscuits were cut, I do one last dry fit to make sure everything fits seamlessly. Then I use a little bit of painter's tape to protect the inside corners of the legs. The reason I'm doing this is so that any kind of glue that seeps out from the corner joints, which are really difficult to get to with sandpaper, are protected, and you can just take off the painter's tape once the glue dries and you'll have a nice clean corner joint on the inside. You don't see me using it on the outside joints because you can just, take a radial orbital sander across those and get out any glue squeeze out pretty easily. But those inside corners are really tough, and it's difficult to make them look pristine once you've got glue. To help me cut the holes in the brace that's going to connect the two legs together, I'm using a self-centering jig that has an opening for a 1/2 inch bit. And, I've marked on both sides of the board where the cuts need to go. But this self-centering bit ensures that you have not only a centered hole, but the hole that is being drilled is completely straight. This allows me to fill up these holes with a little bit of tight bond glue and then come back and hammer in some 1/2 inch walnut dowels, which will then be later used to create the joint that will hold each of the two legs together. Once the glue from the legs is dried, I then take it out of the parallel clamps and remove the painter's tape, and then start the sanding process. I've learned after doing a number of projects like this that it's much easier to do some sanding at this stage before everything is assembled. So I work my way through 120 grit, then 150, and then I stop at 180. I do want to point out that in between my 150 and 180 grit sanding, I actually run an 8-inch roundover across all the surfaces that I'm going to be rounding over for this particular design. That way you do have one final sanding so you can get out some of the marring that's left from the palm router that you use in this particular step. You can also see a couple of holes that I've drilled in the bottom part of the leg, and that's what's going to mate up with the walnut dowels that I just recently completed in a different step. I didn't get camera footage of cutting those holes, but that's what it's going to be used for. Before moving on to the final glue up of the legs, I do a quick dry fit just to make sure everything fits properly. And I take the same precautionary steps to tape off some of those inside corner seams, again, just to protect against some of the glue seep out that can make it really difficult to sand off once you've assembled everything. To complete the final part of the leg assembly glue up, I use some Titebond 1 along with a paintbrush to make sure I've got adequate glue coverage on the inside of the holes as well as on the outside walnut dowels, and then I clamp it all together with some long parallel clamps. To secure the tabletop to the base that we just finished creating, I'll be using some figure 8 connectors shown here. Very simple installation and very simple in premise. Basically, you've got one half the connector that's attached to the legs, and then the other half of the figure 8 sticks out so that you can then come from the other side and connect it to the surface that you're trying to attach it to. To install these, you use a combination of a bit, whether it's a spade bit or a Forstner bit, along with the chisel to essentially countersink these figure 8 connectors into the legs that they're being attached to. Once they've been countersunk, you can come back through with a wood connector. In this case, I'm using some just Phillips head wood screws, and you attach them in place. Once all the figure 8s are in place, I then flip the tabletop upside down and begin to center the legs and mark where I need to pre-drill, because in a later step, whenever I go for final assembly, I will be installing some wood screws after I've applied the finish into these pre-drilled holes. The finish that I'll be using today is Rubio Monocoat in the walnut color. And the reason why I chose this one over the original Rubio Monocoat is it darkens the sapwood on walnut and also accentuates some of the darker grain features within the wood. And to apply it, after you've mixed it in the ratio of 3 parts oil to 1 part accelerator, you trowel it on to begin with, and then you can just wipe it off with a towel, or in my case, you can use a buffer or some sort of a pad on your radial orbital sander to just make sure that you've got really good coverage over the surface that you're applying it to. It's important that you buff as much of it off as you can, because Rubio's philosophy is you can't buff too much off, but you can leave too much on. So I make sure I've got really good coverage, and then I come back later with a microfiber towel and just get as much of the excess off as possible. And what's left is a really nice matte finish that accentuates the dark features of the walnut. I'm really excited to share the pictures of how this entryway table turned out. Not only is the color really bold and vibrant, but the unique figuring in the grain and how that central knot on the tabletop just kind of radiates outward from that one central point just makes this table a really unique feature. Also, some of the shaping that we did with the Kutzall angle grinder attachment helped make the edges of the table quite delicate, which is pretty incredible given that this is all made out of 2-inch thick walnut. I also took some different type of photography shots to help translate some of the natural beauty that I can see in person and make sure that that would come through the lens a little bit better. So I hope you got something out of this video, hope it inspired you to do something in your own, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one.